My two entitled nieces had been regularly stealing my daughter's belongings ever since they moved into our home with my brother-in-law. At first, I thought it was just a matter of setting boundaries, but things quickly spiraled out of control. These girls had absolutely no respect for my daughter's privacy. From the very first day, they walked into her room as if it were theirs, grabbing clothes without asking, treating her space like a free-for-all. I had to pressure them into giving the clothes back, but by then, the damage was already done. When I brought it up with my brother-in-law, he brushed it off like it was nothing, saying, "They're just teenage girls being girls." To my disbelief, my wife agreed. She saw it as harmless, normal behavior, and said I was overreacting. But my daughter didn't see it that way. This was her room, her private space, and they had violated it. As the days passed, the problem only worsened. The twins didn't stop at clothes. They began helping themselves to her jewelry, skincare products, and even her laptop, which my daughter had saved up for and bought with her own money. Despite my warnings, they became more brazen, treating my daughter's things like they were their own personal stash. What finally pushed me over the edge was when my daughter bought a makeup kit for $75, something she'd been saving for over a long time, and one of the twins took it without permission, ruining it beyond repair. I was furious. My daughter had worked hard to afford that makeup kit, and to have it destroyed without a second thought was beyond disrespectful. That day, I decided enough was enough. To protect my daughter, I bought an industrial-sized padlock for her bedroom door, thinking that would finally stop the invasion of her privacy. But when my brother-in-law saw the lock, he was livid. He accused me of treating his daughters like criminals, claiming that they weren't doing anything wrong. His exact words were, "Your spoiled brat can just get another makeup kit from Walmart for $10. I wanted to lunge at him right then and there, but before I could react, my wife stepped in and stopped us. To my shock, she sided with him again, saying it was normal for teenage girls to borrow each other's things, and that I was overreacting. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that I would never remove that lock from our daughter's door. It was her only defense against this constant invasion of her space. But even the lock couldn't stop them. Somehow, the twins found my daughter's spare key, which I had told her to hide in case she ever misplaced hers. I have no idea how they managed to find it, but they did. One day, while my daughter was out, they sneaked into her room again. This time, they went straight for her laptop. They didn't bother with the makeup or clothes, it was the laptop they wanted. When they returned it later that evening, it was completely destroyed. The screen was cracked, the keyboard wouldn't respond, and it wouldn't even turn on. My daughter was devastated. That laptop wasn't just a piece of technology, it held everything. Months of essays, projects, and personal photos, all wiped out. She had worked so hard on those assignments, staying up late into the night to perfect them, and now they were gone. When she saw the damage, she broke down completely, collapsing to the floor and clutching the broken laptop in her arms as she sobbed uncontrollably. I had never seen her like that before, and it tore me apart. My heart shattered as I watched her cry. It wasn't just about the laptop, it was about everything that had been taken from her, her privacy, her hard work, and her sense of security in her own home. Fueled by rage, I stormed into the living room where my brother-in-law was sitting, completely oblivious to the destruction his daughters had caused. I told him what had happened, expecting at least an apology. Instead, he shrugged and said, "It's no big deal. That's why you back things up?" His nonchalance made my blood boil. He didn't care about the emotional toll this had taken on my daughter, nor did he understand what that laptop meant to her. It wasn't just about the physical item, it was the time and effort she had poured into her work, now ruined because of his daughter's carelessness. I demanded that he hold his daughters accountable. He agreed to talk to them, but he kept insisting that they hadn't done it on purpose, as if that excused everything. After a long, heated argument, he reluctantly offered to cover part of the cost of replacing the laptop, but he acted like he was doing me a favor. As if I should be grateful. His arrogance was infuriating, and the tension in the house grew even worse after that. My wife, who had always tried to remain neutral, was growing increasingly frustrated. She was starting to see just how out of control the situation had become. I could see the strain in her face every time we argued. She defended her brother less and less, but she still held on to the hope that things would work themselves out if we gave it enough time. But I knew better. The only way this would end was if we took drastic action. A week later, in desperate need of a break, my wife, daughter, and I decided to take a weekend trip to a nearby resort. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a chance to escape the stress and chaos at home. And for a brief moment, it worked. We laughed, we spent time at the amusement park nearby, and for the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. I almost believed that things would get better. But that peace was shattered the moment we walked back into the house. As soon as we opened the front door, we were hit by the overpowering stench of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and something sickeningly sweet. My wife gasped beside me as we surveyed the living room. It was a complete disaster. The couch cushions were strewn across the floor, empty cans and bottles were scattered everywhere, and muddy footprints tracked through the house. The coffee table had been shoved against the wall, and it looked like a wild party had taken place in our absence. My stomach churned as I bolted up the stairs, 2 at a time, praying that my daughter's room hadn't been touched. When I reached the door, I froze, seeing that the door had been smashed in, hanging slightly ajar. A wave of unease washed over me as I stepped into the room. It was a scene of complete chaos, dresser drawers yanked out violently, clothes flung haphazardly across the floor, and the bed, once neatly made, now left in disarray. The laptop, which usually sat on the small desk in the corner, was gone. I could still feel the remnants of someone's frantic presence lingering in the air, a violation that cut deeper than the physical damage. Behind me, I heard my wife's soft footsteps approaching. Her sharp intake of breath was the only sound that followed, her shock too raw for words. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling as she surveyed the scene. Her eyes darted from the broken lock to the chaos inside, her body frozen in disbelief. For a long moment, she stood silent, her hand rising to cover her mouth, as though trying to hold back the overwhelming rush of emotions. She didn't move. Downstairs, the front door clicked open. We heard the unmistakable sound of my brother-in-law strolling in, completely unaware of the wreckage that lay above him. He sauntered into the room a moment later, phone in hand, a lazy grin on his face. "Oh yeah, the kids had a little party while you were out," he said with a casual shrug, barely even glancing at the disaster in front of him. His tone was so light, so dismissive, it made my blood boil. "They got a bit carried away, but it's no big deal," he added with an almost carefree laugh, like this was all just part of growing up. I felt my wife's tension build beside me, her body rigid, her face pale with anger. She didn't move for a moment, taking it all in, processing the enormity of what had happened. This room was everything to her, she said in a low, tight voice, more to herself than anyone else. But he didn't seem to register her words, his attention still fixed on his phone. "Relax," he said, waving her off. "We threw way worse parties as kids. Remember the one in high school? Mom and Dad were out of town, and we had the whole crew over. We wrecked the house, but cleaned it up before they even got back. No problem." He smiled, reminiscing like it was some kind of badge of honor, completely missing the gravity of the situation. My wife wasn't having it. Her voice, though still quiet, was sharp. "That was different," she snapped, her eyes blazing. "We cleaned it up. This is nothing like that." Her words cut through the room, hanging heavy in the air. He tried to shrug it off again, saying the kids would clean it up, that we were blowing things out of proportion. But for the first time since they had moved in, I saw my wife stand up against her brother. She stepped forward, her voice low but steely as she said, "You're going to clean this up and pay for the damage." His grin faltered. He looked genuinely confused, like he hadn't considered that he might be held accountable for any of this. He started to argue, insisting it was just a party, no harm done. But my wife cut him off mid-sentence, her patience gone. "Your twins need to take responsibility," she said, her tone leaving no room for debate. For a moment, he stared at her, his face clouded with frustration. It looked like he might argue again, but then something shifted. He swallowed whatever words he had been preparing and let out a huge, exaggerated sigh. "Fine, I'll take care of it," he muttered, clearly irritated but unwilling to push back any further. He wasn't used to being called out, especially not by his sister. As he slouched off, I felt something inside me ease. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone in this fight. My wife had always been caught between her family and the reality of what was happening in our home, but now, for the first time, she was standing with me. That evening, after everything had quieted down, I sat at the kitchen table, going over our finances. Something had been nagging at me for weeks, a small, persistent worry that I hadn't been able to shake. Our savings account was lower than expected, but I couldn't quite figure out why. I started combing through the bank records, and that's when I noticed the pattern, small recurring withdrawals, every few days. $50 here, $75 there. Individually, they weren't alarming, but over time, they added up. My stomach sank as I tallied the totals, more than $11,000 gone. I double-checked everything, hoping I had made a mistake, but the numbers didn't lie. The withdrawal patterns didn't match our normal spending habits, and I knew my wife was just as careful with our finances as I was. And then it hit me, there was only one other person with access to the account. When my wife got home, I laid the bank records in front of her, pointing to the recurring withdrawals. Her face grew pale as she flipped through the pages, the realization dawning on her. The dates and amounts pointed to one person, her brother. For a moment, she just stared at the papers, as though hoping they would reveal a different answer. Then, with a heavy sigh, she dropped them onto the table. The tension in the air was thick, and neither of us said much. We didn't have to wait long to confront him. He came in later that night, completely unaware of what was about to hit him. I didn't hold back. I laid the bank records out in front of him, demanding an explanation before he had a chance to spin any excuses. His face fell as soon as he saw the papers. He admitted to taking the money right away but tried to downplay it, saying it wasn't what we thought. He'd been struggling, he explained, and had started using the money for football bets on some online gambling site. But he swore he was close to winning big and just needed a little more time, and a couple more $100, and then he'd pay it all back. He promised that it was almost over. I could see the disbelief in my wife's eyes as he talked. His words were desperate, frantic, like he was trying to convince himself as much as us. He kept insisting he was close, that it would all be fine soon, but the more he talked, the less sense it made. My wife finally cut him off, her voice cold and sharp. "You've stolen from your own family," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she pointed to the bank statements. "For what? A chance at some quick cash?" He opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he saw the look on her face. Even as he agreed to pay it back, I knew things would never be the same. The trust that had once existed between them was shattered. She couldn't even look at him the same way anymore. In the days that followed, the tension in the house became unbearable. My wife tried to maintain some semblance of peace, but the distance between her and her brother was obvious. She no longer defended him, no longer brushed off his actions with excuses. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. Then, one afternoon, I got a call at work. Our daughter had collapsed at school. The principal told me she had passed out in the hallway between classes. They thought it was exhaustion, but when we got to the hospital, the doctor didn't sugarcoat it. He said it was caused by stress. She was physically and emotionally burned out. It wasn't school, though. It was home. The constant tension, the fights over her space, the twins always messing with her, it had all taken a toll. She was pale and weak, lying in that hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, her small body drained of energy. I glanced at my wife. I could see the shock on her face, the guilt settling in as she realized how bad things had gotten. All those times I had told her that the situation at home was too much, that our daughter was suffering, she had brushed it off. But now, here we were, with undeniable proof. She didn't say much, but I didn't need her to. The guilt was written all over her face. She sat quietly for a long time, then leaned over and took our daughter's hand. I could tell that something had finally clicked for her. After the hospital visit, we returned home, and I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. The situation had spiraled out of control, and it was time to face my brother-in-law. When I walked into the living room, I found him lounging on the couch, oblivious to the wreckage he had caused. His casual attitude, once just annoying, now enraged me. Without wasting any time, I told him that he and his daughters needed to leave. Enough was enough. At first, he resisted, playing the family card, saying he had nowhere else to go, as though that somehow excused everything. He tried to guilt me into changing my mind, but this time, I didn't budge. My daughter's well-being was at stake, and I wasn't going to sacrifice that for anyone, not even him. The turning point came when my wife stepped in. She had been stuck in the middle for so long, defending him, brushing off his behavior, but after seeing our daughter in the hospital, something had shifted. She backed me up, her voice firm and unwavering. "You have to go," she said, and I could see the guilt in